The Frankfurt School. You've probably heard of its critical theory, right? But its origin story? Well, that's one of the strangest, most contradictory tales in all of intellectual history. It's a story that really begins with a puzzle. So, at its very heart, the Institute for Social Research, which, would later become the Frankfurt School, it was founded to be this bastion of Marxist thought. The whole goal was to study and theorize how to overthrow the very system they were living in. But here's where it gets weird. The first big twist. All of this anti-capitalist thinking, it was bankrolled by Hermann Weyl, the world's largest grain trader. I mean, think about that. A titan of global capital paid to create a think tank basically designed to bring down capitalism. And the final piece, and this one's a shocker, the very building that housed all these mostly Jewish Marxist intellectuals, it was designed by an architect who would later become a member of the Nazi Party and even take part in a deadly anti-Semitic pogrom. It just sounds impossible, doesn't it? A Marxist institute funded by a capitalist in a building built by a future Nazi? So the big question is, how on earth did this completely upside-down world come to be? All right, let's dive in and unpack this. To really get a handle on the institute, we first have to understand the city where it was born, Frankfurt, in the 1920s. And this place, it was a city of extreme and ultimately tragic contradictions. The duality of Frankfurt back then is just stunning. On one hand, you had the second largest Jewish population in all of Germany. They even elected their first Jewish mayor in 1924. But on the other hand, Frankfurt was the headquarters of IG Farben, the chemical giant that would go on to produce Zyklon B for the gas chambers at Auschwitz. It was the city of vibrant Jewish life, and at the same time, the looming machinery of mass murder. This number is just chilling. In 1933, Frankfurt's Jewish population was 26,000. Before the war ended, 9,000 had been deported. Today, the city's wall of names remembers 11,134 citizens who were killed in the Holocaust. This was the incredibly hostile environment the Institute was born into. Now, the human story behind the Institute's funding is just as paradoxical as the city itself. It's kind of a classic father-son story, but with a seriously revolutionary twist. Okay, so picture this. You've got Hermann Weyl, the father. He's the quintessential capitalist, made his fortune in global trade. And then there's his son, Felix, who called himself a salon Bolshevik. So Felix goes to his hyper-capitalist dad and asks for a huge pile of cash, not for a yacht or a fancy estate, but to fund an institute that would theorize the downfall of his father's entire economic world. And the craziest part, Hermann said yes. The composer Hans Eisler just nailed the absurdity of the whole thing with this line. He's capturing that central irony perfectly. The institute was set up to study the source of poverty, which, of course, was the very person paying for the research. And believe me, the paradoxes don't stop there. The very walls of the institute held a dark secret, a secret embodied in the man who designed it. The architect, a guy named Franz Ruckel, had a truly shocking career path. In 1908, he builds this beautiful synagogue. Then, in 1924, he designs the building for this group of mostly Jewish Marxists. But then, less than a decade later, he joins the Nazi Party, and he was even jailed for his role in a pogrom where 2 Jewish theater entrepreneurs died while fleeing a kidnapping attempt that he was a part of. This newspaper quote just puts it so bluntly, so brutally. The same man who created a physical space for Jewish intellectuals would later become an active participant in their persecution. It's a grim, unforgettable irony right at the heart of the Institute's very foundation. So out of this cauldron of contradictions, a Marxist institute paid for by a capitalist, housed in a building designed by a future Nazi, came the central intellectual project of the Frankfurt School. And this was the burning question on everyone's mind. Why didn't the working class in Germany overthrow capitalism after World War I? I mean, according to classic Marxist theory, post-war Germany with its crushing defeat and hyperinflation was totally ripe for a workers' revolution. But it never happened. And the Institute was founded to figure out why. What was stopping the revolution? Their whole investigation really started with this big concept, alienation. This is the general idea that under capitalism, people just feel disconnected from the things they make, from their own work, and ultimately, from their own humanity. Okay, so let's drill down a bit more. Reification is a key part of this. It's the process where human relationships and even our own qualities start to feel like objects, like things. We become objects to ourselves and to others, something to be managed or used, not a full person. And that leads us to the final step here, commodity fetishism. Just think about your smartphone for a second. It seems to have this magical life of its own, right? But that magical quality completely hides the reality of the exploited labor that went into making it. The Frankfurt School argued that this allure of things is what pacifies the masses and stops them from seeing their own exploitation. So, the Frankfurt School developed all these powerful critiques, but their legacy, well, it's just as full of paradox as their origins, especially when you look at the whole action versus theory debate. Despite being nicknamed Cafe Marx, the Institute was incredibly cautious. It really operated more like a monastery than some revolutionary headquarters. They were all about intellectual independence, and they insisted on removing provocative words like Marxism and revolution from their papers so they wouldn't scare off sponsors. And ultimately, they grew pretty pessimistic, concluding that the working class just wasn't a real force for change anymore. Now, contrast that academic quietism with this guy, Richard Sorge, the Institute's very first librarian. While the scholars were deep in theory, Sorge was out there living a life of high-stakes espionage. He was a committed Soviet spy who actually infiltrated the Nazi Party in Japan and gave Moscow a crucial warning about the impending Nazi invasion. He was a man of direct, world-changing action, working right alongside thinkers who had pretty much given up on it. And this brings us to our final, really provocative takeaway. The critic Gillian Rose argued that the Frankfurt School ultimately academicized politics instead of politicizing academia. So the question is still out there. Was the Frankfurt School a revolutionary force that totally changed how we think, or was it a group of brilliant minds who just retreated into theory, kind of like a conservative sheep in a radical wolf's clothing? The paradox, it seems, continues.